The story almost everyone knows goes like this. On a small island in the South Pacific, a people cut down every last tree to drag their giant statues across the land. They stripped their own world bare. They fell into famine and slaughter, and they tore their civilization apart. All of it, the story says, long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. A whole people who destroyed themselves. There is only one problem with it. When a European ship finally did appear, the first one ever to find the island, the people were still there. Not a broken remnant picking through ruins. A few thousand of them, living. Their fields were planted and worked. Smoke rose from their fires. And along the coast, their ancestors still stood in stone, cared for and tended, not the relics of a world that had ended. And the evidence we have now says something stranger than survival. In the generations leading up to that first ship, these people were not even holding steady. They were still growing. A people who had eaten their own world hollow are not still growing when the first sail comes over the horizon. And the part the famous story gets most wrong is not that these people were fine. What was coming for them was worse, and it was already on its way. It would not come from inside the island, it would come across that same horizon, by ship, with a date and a count, and the world would look away from it for 100 years. So if these people did not do this to themselves, then who did? And why has the story we all know spent so long looking the other way? To answer it, start with the first stranger who ever wrote the island down. On Easter Sunday, the 5th of April 1722, a Dutch expedition under Jacob Roggeveen reached an island no European map had yet charted. What they raised on the horizon that morning was a low triangle of volcanic rock, treeless, scoured by wind, with no harbour worth the name. And then they got close enough to see it properly. What they found was a place that was very much alive. The expedition recorded a land under cultivation, fields planted, low walls of stacked stone, ground worked and tended. And from the ships, in the days before they landed, the Dutch had seen smoke rising in several places and taken it for the sign of a people living there. They recorded the giant statues standing along the coast, upright and venerated. And it is worth being clear about what those statues were, because the famous story almost never is. They were not idols, and they were not decoration. Each one stood on a platform of stacked stone, and each one faced inland, its back to the sea, looking out over the houses and the fields. They were ancestors. Carved likenesses of the dead, set up to watch over the living, the way a family keeps a portrait of a grandfather on the wall. The people Roggeveen saw were living under the gaze of their own forefathers in stone. And he counted those people. The estimate the expedition brought home was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. It was a rough count, a sailor's eye over a strange shore, but it was the only one anyone took, and it is the first number this story has. A few thousand people on a small island, with their ancestors standing over their fields, and the fields full. Not a ruin in sight. Keep that number close. 2,000 to 3,000. It is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story, and the reason will not become clear for a while. Is 2,000 to 3,000 a lot of people for an island like this, or hardly any at all? Leave the question open. Because here is what makes the visit strange in hindsight. The statues these strangers saw standing were not the relics of some vanished golden age, abandoned and forgotten. The carving of new giants had effectively ended generations earlier, before this morning. But the statues that stood were not dead monuments. They were tended. They were venerated. They still faced inland over living houses, and the people still kept them, the way you keep a shrine you have not stopped believing in. This was not the wreckage of a faith that had died with its makers. It was a living religion, gathered around statues that had been standing for a long time. A thriving island, counted by a stranger. And yet, within 150 years, on this same shore, there would be almost no one left. Somewhere between that morning and that emptiness sits the story the whole world would come to believe. So where did that story come from? It came in its modern and most famous form from a single book. In 2005, a geographer named Jared Diamond published a bestseller about why societies fail, and he gave Easter Island its own chapter. He called it, in a line that would be quoted for the next 2 decades, the clearest example of a society that destroyed itself by overexploiting its own resources. That is the prosecution's case in a single sentence. And to be fair to it, it is a powerful one. And Diamond did not invent it. He gathered a story that had been building for years and told it better than anyone, to more people than anyone. The story he told runs like this. Some centuries before, Polynesian voyagers reached the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. It is hard to overstate how far out it sits. The nearest inhabited land is more than 2,000 kilometers of open ocean away, and the people who found it crossed that distance in canoes, navigating by stars and swells and the flight of birds, with no instruments and no maps. They arrived, by the best current evidence, around the year 1200. They found a forested island, and over the centuries that followed, they did something with it that still stops people in their tracks. They carved close to 1,000 stone giants out of the volcanic rock of a single quarry, finished them, and raised them on platforms of stacked stone along the coast, facing inland, watching over the living. This was the work of a small people on a poor and shrinking island at the edge of the inhabited world. And then, the parable says, they destroyed themselves making them. To move the giants, they felled the forest for timber to roll them on. The trees ran out. The soil washed away. The food failed. The people, it goes on, turned on each other, descending into warfare and finally into cannibalism, until the island that had grown to perhaps 15,000 souls had eaten itself hollow, and the survivors were a broken remnant of what they had been. The two most lurid pieces of that, the warfare and the cannibalism, turn out to be the parts the record supports least. Hold that for a moment. A warning written in stone for a finite planet. It is a complete story. It has a beginning, a sin, and a punishment. And that completeness is part of why it held for so long. Now go back to those two darkest pieces, the warfare and the cannibalism, and look at what actually holds them up. The cannibalism rests almost entirely on oral tradition that 19th and 20th century outsiders wrote down, and on the sense, in Diamond's own telling, that the traditions seemed preoccupied with it. But when an expedition went to the island in 1914 and asked the islanders directly, they rejected the idea of ancestral cannibalism firmly. And in the ground itself, In the bones, where eaten people would leave a trace, there is scarcely any physical evidence for it at all. The mass intertribal warfare stands on similar footing. Claimed loudly, evidenced thinly. These are the most repeated, most lurid parts of the parable, and they are the parts the record supports least. Before going any further, one guardrail, because it matters for everything that follows. Not every researcher accepts the version of events this video is about to lay out. One of the most respected scholars of the statues has argued that the people overturning the old story are partly attacking a straw man. Real environmental damage and real population stress on the island remain, she says, and should not be waved away in the rush to clear the islander's name. She is right to insist on it. What follows is the overturning of a verdict. It is not the crowning of a new certainty, and the difference between those two things is worth carrying the whole way through. So the parable stands on a few load-bearing beams. The forest, felled to move the statues. The vast population that overran the island. The crash before any European arrived. Take them one at a time. Start with the trees. The whole logging story hangs on one buried assumption, that to move a statue, you needed logs. Roll the giant on timber, the thinking went, and you need a great deal of timber, so you cut the forest down. Pull that assumption out, and the motive for the felling starts to wobble. So how were the statues actually moved? For a long time, that looked like the island's deepest puzzle. Consider the scale of the thing they were moving. The largest giant the islanders ever raised stood almost 10 meters tall and weighed as much as 80 tons. And they walked it from the quarry where it was cut all the way to a platform on the coast. And one they never finished still lies in that quarry. 20-odd meters of stone, so large it may have been more than anyone could ever have stood upright at all. Moving an 80-ton giant across kilometers of open ground with no wheels and no draft animals seems to demand either an enormous workforce or a vast quantity of rolled timber, or both. But the answer, when it came, was almost embarrassingly simple. And it had been hiding in plain sight in the way the islanders themselves always described it. They did not say their ancestors carried the statues. They said the statues walked. In 2012, a team decided to take that literally. They built a faithful replica of a moai, just under 4.5 tons of concrete, the proportions taken from the real statues. Looking at it standing there on the open ground, the thing seemed immovable. 4.5 tons is roughly the weight of a large pickup truck stood on its end, and there were no wheels, no rollers, no draft animals anywhere in sight. They stood it upright. They tied 3 ropes to it, one to each side and one to the back to keep it from pitching forward onto its face. And then a small crowd took up the ropes. Not hundreds. 18 people. They began to pull in rhythm, the side ropes alternating, a heave to the left, then a heave to the right. The statue leaned. It tipped onto one edge of its flat base and pivoted forward. And as it came down, the team on the other side hauled, and it tipped the other way and pivoted again. Left, right, left. The giant began to move down the road on its own base, upright, swinging from foot to foot, walking. It is the exact motion you use, without thinking, to move a refrigerator across a kitchen floor. You do not lift it, you walk it, corner over corner. The replica covered 100 meters in 40 minutes. The archaeologist who walked it described what it felt like to do. Once you get it moving, he said, it isn't hard at all. People are pulling with one arm. It conserves energy and it moves really quickly. And once you have seen it move, the design of the statues stops looking like art alone and starts looking like engineering. The real moai are not built like a standing person. They lean slightly forward and they are heavy and wide through the base. Those are exactly the proportions you would give an object you intended to rock forward and walk. The shape that had always read as solemn and frontal turns out to also be the shape of a thing built to travel. And the island's own roads fit it. The old statue roads are wide and they have a gently concave cross-section, a shallow groove down the middle, exactly the shape that would cradle a rocking giant and keep it from toppling sideways. That reading of the roads is itself still argued over, but the walking fits the shape of the ground. So the deepest puzzle of Easter Island has an answer, and the answer is not a mystery. It is engineering, patient, clever, and entirely human. The statues needed no logs and only a handful of people, which means the forest did not fall to move them. The motive in the famous story is gone, but the forest did fall. That part is real. So if the islanders did not strip it to roll their statues, what happened to the trees? Begin with the part nobody disputes. The forest is gone, and it was gone early. When the first settlers arrived, the island was covered in a now extinct palm. By the time Roggeveen counted the living in 1722, that forest had effectively been gone for decades. The pollen record puts its disappearance around the middle of the 1600s, well before any sustained European presence. The island the parable imagines being stripped bare had, in fact, lost its great forest. That is not in question. What is in question is the cause. And the cause turns out to be more crowded than one people with axes. Start with what the settlers brought with them. When the Polynesians came, they did not come alone. In their canoes, as stowaways or as food, came the Pacific rat. And a rat dropped onto an island with no predators and a forest full of fat, oily palm seeds is a rat in paradise. Run the arithmetic forward, and the result is hard to take in. A single breeding pair, multiplying unchecked, becomes millions in under 50 years. By one estimate, more than 11 million rats inside half a century. And what do 11 million rats eat on an island whose forest depends on a slow, heavy, slow-sprouting seed? They eat the seeds. By the modelling, the rats destroyed something like 95% of the palm's seeds. A forest can stand for a long time after its last generation of seedlings has been quietly eaten out from under it. And then, one storm or one felled tree at a time, it simply does not come back. The people played their part too, clearing ground with fire to farm, cutting trees for the ordinary work of living. The truer reading is not that the rats did it instead of the people. It is that the rats and the people did it together, and that neither was trying to destroy anything, they were trying to live. And then the sky closed over the whole picture. From around the year 1550, the island entered a drought that lasted more than a century, rainfall falling far below what the previous 300 years had known. And it is in exactly this window that the great age of statue building slows and turns. The carving tapers off, the platforms stop being added to, and the island's ritual life shifts away from the stone ancestors and towards something new. It moved to a wind-swept crater on the southwestern coast, on a high rim above the sea, and it took the form of a competition. Once a year, men representing the island's groups would descend the sheer cliff, swim out through cold and shark-ridden water to a small islet offshore, and wait, sometimes for weeks, for a particular seabird to lay the season's first egg. The man who carried that egg back unbroken One for his group, for a year, a kind of sacred standing. The whole apparatus of belief that had once gone into raising ancestors in stone now went into a single egg and the man who could bring it home. Read through the parable. That turn looks like the symptom of a society falling apart, abandoning its gods in the chaos of collapse. Read through the rainfall. It looks like something else entirely. A people who could no longer pour their effort into moving giants, in a century of failing rain, found a new way to settle who led and who mattered. It is not the picture of a society dying. It is the picture of a society changing the rules of its own life and carrying on. A small people adapting sensibly to a hard century. So 3 things bore down on the forest at once. The people cleared and burned, the rats ate the seed, and a long drought pressed down on all of it. The island came out of those centuries genuinely changed, poorer, balder, harder to live on. The genome researchers who later studied the islanders' own DNA say so plainly. The arrival of humans, they note, dramatically changed the ecosystem. None of this is a paradise, none of it is innocence. A forest can disappear without a civilization choosing to die. And once you stop needing armies of loggers to drag the statues, a strange thing happens to the rest of the famous story. The huge population, the 15,000 people the crash requires, loses the job it was invented to do. So how many people were ever actually here? The crash story has a hidden requirement. To crash from a great height, you need the great height first. You need a peak, a population swollen far past what the island could bear, primed to fall. Diamond reached for a number that may have exceeded 15,000. So the real question underneath the whole parable is not how did they fall, it is how high could they ever have climbed? And to answer that, you do not dig for bones or read old chronicles. You ask the island itself how much food it could grow. That is the first scene worth slowing down for. A few years ago, a team set out to measure not the people, but the fields. The Rapanui farmed in a particular way suited to a windy, drying, nutrient-poor island. They broke up volcanic rock and worked the fragments into the soil, a kind of stone mulch that sheltered the seedlings, trapped moisture, and slowly fed the ground with minerals. These rock gardens leave a signature in the land. And using satellite imaging that reads the mineral fingerprint of the surface, the team mapped them across the whole island. Every plot, every patch, the full agricultural footprint of the people who had lived there. What they found was small. The gardens covered only a sliver of the island, on the order of 1% of its surface. And from that footprint, you can work out how many mouths the land could feed. The answer came back at roughly 3,000 people. Even stretching every assumption, adding in the fish, the seabirds, the most generous numbers, the island tops out somewhere short of 4,000. It could never have fed 15,000. The peak the crash needs was never physically possible. One of the researchers who mapped the gardens put it about as plainly as it can be put. This is not, he said, an example of ecological catastrophe. It is an example of how people survived, despite really limited natural resources, in a fairly sustainable way for a long time. Now set 2 numbers next to each other. The island could sustainably feed around 3,000 people, and when the first European stepped ashore and counted the living, he counted between 2,000 and 3,000. Those are the same number. The head count the stranger took in 1722 is not the wreckage of some lost multitude that had already starved away. It is, near enough, the number the island was built to hold. There was no missing 15,000. There was no crowd that vanished. The population the parable needs in order to crash is a population that, on the evidence of the soil, never existed. That is the question from the very first European morning, finally answered. 2,000 to 3,000 was not hardly any people. It was, more or less, all the people the island could ever have. But carrying capacity is an argument about what could have happened. It would be better to read the population directly, to watch the line of it rise or fall across the centuries. And a few years ago, for the first time, that became possible. This is the second scene to slow down for, and it is a quiet one. In a laboratory far from the island, researchers worked with the remains of 15 ancient islanders. The work of reading a genome out of old bone is slow and painstaking and easy to ruin. Ancient DNA comes out of the bone in tiny broken fragments, mixed with the genetic traces of every microbe and every modern hand that has ever touched the sample. And the whole craft is teasing the original sequence back out of that contamination, base by base, in a clean room under gloves. From those 15 individuals, the team rebuilt the genomes. And a genome carries more than the story of one person. It carries a memory of the whole population that person came from. The number of people in a community, generation after generation, leaves a faint statistical pattern written in the diversity of their descendants' genes. A population that crashes and squeezes down to a handful of survivors carries the scar of that bottleneck in its DNA for centuries afterward, like a tree carries a ring from a year of drought. So from 15 genomes, the team could reconstruct the shape of the population line itself, rising or falling across the centuries before contact.
The line they read did not crash. It did not even dip. It showed a population that grew steadily from around the 13th century all the way up to the moment Europeans arrived. This came from just 15 genomes, a small sample, but enough to read the shape of the line. No bottleneck, no squeeze, no catastrophe written into the blood of the people who descended from it. And this is the line in the whole story that has to be held exactly. What that genome reading proves is narrow and precise. There was no demographic collapse on Easter Island before contact. Not nothing ever went wrong. Not it was a paradise. The forest still fell. The drought still came. The island was still poor and still hard. But the people did not multiply into millions and then starve and slaughter themselves down to a remnant. Before the Europeans came, they grew. And there is one more thing tucked inside those 15 genomes, something to keep for later. The reason researchers could read this DNA at all is that there were descendants to read it from. These 15 ancient islanders were the ancestors of people who survived. Survived what? The parable never quite asks. Because if the islanders did not destroy themselves, and the soil and the blood agree they did not before contact, then the question the parable never asked is suddenly the only one left. If they did not do it to themselves, who did? The answer does not arrive all at once. It arrives the way the catastrophe itself did, slowly first, over 140 years, and then all at once. Go back to Roggeveen on the shore in 1722, with his count of a few thousand people, and his fields full, and his statues standing. That was the high water mark of the island the islanders had made for themselves. It was also the last time a European would see it whole. Because from the moment his ships sailed away, the strangers kept coming, and every visit took something. 48 years passed before the next one. In 1770, a Spanish expedition arrived, went ashore, and performed a small ceremony that the islanders can have made no sense of at all. The Spaniards planted 3 crosses on a hilltop, read out a document, and claimed the entire island for a king on the far side of the world whose name the people had never heard. Then they sailed away too. From the island side, a ship had appeared. Men had come ashore and put up 3 timber crosses for reasons known only to themselves, and the ship had gone. But something had changed all the same. The island was now, on paper in Madrid, owned. 4 years later, in 1774, Captain James Cook anchored offshore, and the island he found was not the one Roggeveen had described. It was thinner, it was warier. Cook's people put the population at only a few hundred, far below the count of 50 years before, though that figure is low enough that it may reflect a frightened people keeping out of sight as much as a true decline. What was not ambiguous was the statues. Where Roggeveen had seen the stone ancestors standing and venerated, Cook saw some of them lying on the ground, fallen, and the ones still up, looking neglected. The 3 Spanish crosses were gone. In the years between the 2 visits, the island had begun, quietly, to come down. A French expedition under La Pérouse stopped in 1786 and found perhaps 2,000 people, and only about a tenth of the island under cultivation. Each of these visits was brief. None of them was a massacre. But each one left something behind that did not sail away. Consider the most ordinary thing a visiting ship carried, which was illness. The people of Easter Island had lived for 5 centuries in near total isolation, more cut off than almost any community on Earth, and isolation has a hidden cost. A population that has never met a given disease has no inherited defense against it, none at all, and a sickness that a European sailor might shrug off in a week could move through such a people like fire through dry grass. Every ship that called was a chance for one more of those sicknesses to step ashore, in the body of a sailor who did not even know he carried it. Add to that a handful of people seized here and there to fill out a short-handed crew as more and more vessels began to call. None of it looked like a catastrophe on the day it happened, but it never stopped, and it only ran one direction. For 140 years, the island thinned, slowly, under the ordinary traffic of a world that had found it. And the famous story would later gather all of that thinning up and fold it into its tale of a people destroying themselves, as though no ship had ever come at all. And then, in December of 1862, the thinning stopped being slow. The ships that came that month came from Peru to take people. The guano mines and the plantations on the South American coast needed labor, and raiders had begun working the islands of the Pacific for it. They reached Easter Island, and they carried off, in the space of those weeks, somewhere between 1,400 and 1,500 people. On an island of a few thousand, that was something close to a third of everyone, and by some accounts, as many as half. The numbers from one of those ships survive, and they are hard to read slowly. 470 islanders were loaded onto a single vessel built to carry 160. Of those 470, 15 were still alive at the end of it. There is nothing to add to that. The date, the ship, the number. They carry their own weight, and anything laid on top of them would only make them lighter. The raids did not pass unnoticed. As word spread, they drew protest from missionaries and from foreign governments. and within months, the authorities in Peru were pressured into ordering the surviving islanders freed and returned. On paper, that is where the story turns merciful. It did not. By the time the order came, most of the people who had been taken were already gone, worn down by the labor and by the same diseases the ships had always carried. Of the hundreds seized, only a small remnant were still alive to be sent back, and the return voyage took more of them. The handful who finally stepped ashore on their own island again were a fraction of those who had left. And they did not come back empty-handed. One thing belongs here, set down carefully, because the parable leaned hard on it. Somewhere across these decades, the islanders brought their own statues down. The giants that Roggeveen had seen standing in 1722 were, by the 1830s, almost all face down on the ground, only the figures on the quarry slope still upright. The old story reads the toppling as the violence of a society tearing itself apart. But the toppling went on into the contact era, the era of the visiting ships and the disruption they brought. So it is not cleanly a symptom of some pre-contact collapse at all. Why the islanders lowered their own ancestors to the earth, and exactly when, is one of the things still genuinely unknown. A loss of faith in the old gods, the shock of contact, open conflict, all have been proposed, and none is settled. It is a real open question, and it is more honest to leave it open. But the thing that emptied the island was not the toppling, it was what the freed survivors carried back with them across the water. The handful who survived the mines and were sent home carried smallpox with them. The disease moved through a population that had no defense against it, and the epidemic that followed killed roughly 1,000 more people. Then, in 1867, tuberculosis reached the island and took about a quarter of those who were still left. And by around 1877, on the island that a stranger had once counted at 2,000 to 3,000 living souls, with their fields planted and their giants standing, the people who remained numbered about 110. From a few thousand to 110, in a single human lifetime, the island lost on the order of 94% of its people. This was the collapse. Not the one in the famous story, this one, dated, documented, and arriving from somewhere else. And now the thing tucked away earlier comes back. Those 15 ancient islanders whose DNA showed a population that grew and never crashed before contact were read from the genomes of survivors. The roughly 110 who lived through 1877 did not vanish. They endured, and they had descendants, and those descendants are on the island still. The DNA that cleared their ancestors of destroying themselves is the DNA of the people who outlasted the catastrophe that did come. The people taught to the world for 50 years as the textbook case of a society that committed suicide were, on the evidence of their own bodies, the survivors of something done to them from outside. The story said they did it to themselves. The record says it was done to them. An overturned verdict is not a new certainty, and the honest version of this story keeps its open questions in plain sight. Some of them are simple absences. The true height the population reached before contact is still not pinned down. The best evidence points low, to the few thousand the island could feed, but the exact peak is not something anyone can yet name with confidence. Why the islanders brought their own statues down, and exactly when, is genuinely unresolved. These are honest holes in the story, and the honest thing is to leave them as holes, rather than fill them with a tidy guess, the way the old parable did. There is also, on the island, a script that no one has been able to read, rows of carved signs whose meaning is lost. But that is a story for another day. But there is one open question that is not an absence at all. It is a wonder. And it sits right inside the same 15 genomes that cleared the islander's name. When the researchers read those 15 genomes, they were looking for one thing: whether the population had crashed before contact. It had not. But buried in the same data was something nobody had gone looking for. About 1/10 of the islanders' ancestry did not come from Polynesia at all. It traced to the Americas, to indigenous people of the South American mainland, more than 3,500 kilometers of open ocean to the east. These were not Polynesian genes that happened to resemble American ones. They were American. And the timing is the part that stops you. The contact that mixed those two ancestries together can be dated from the genomes themselves, because the longer two bloodlines have been blended, the more thoroughly the genetic signatures get shuffled and broken up, generation by generation. The shuffling on the island points to a contact around the 13 or 1400s. That is centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Centuries before any European is supposed to have bridged the Pacific at all. Somewhere in those years, on the most isolated patch of inhabited land on the planet, Polynesian and South American people met and had children, and those children's descendants were living on the island when Roggeveen counted them. Which way the canoe went, the DNA cannot say. That is the honest limit of it. The genes record that the meeting happened and roughly when, but not where it took place, and not who crossed to whom. Maybe Rapanui voyagers, the same people who had found this speck of land in a vast ocean by reading stars and swells, pushed on east, reached the coast of South America, and came home. Maybe people from the Americas, in their own craft, reached this most remote of islands. The evidence does not choose between those two stories, and it is more honest not to choose for it. But it does close the door on one old myth before it opens the new wonder. This is not the story the adventurer Thor Heyerdahl tried to tell, of South Americans settling and building Polynesia. The island is Polynesian, settled by Polynesians, its language and its tools and the great bulk of its blood, all from the West. The American 10th is not the origin of these people. It is something stranger and quieter. A single, real, dated thread of contact across an ocean the rest of the world would not cross for 200 more years. What is known, and it is enough, is this. The people we were taught to remember as islanders, too foolish to manage a single small island, had, centuries before, reached across thousands of kilometers of empty Pacific and touched a continent. The same record that clears them of destroying their world shows them doing something the rest of the world thought impossible. There is one more question left, and it is not about the island at all. It is about us. If the evidence was this thin all along, why did the tale of self-destruction hold for so long, and why did it feel so right? Part of the answer is that the parable was useful. A people who cut down their last tree and starved in the ruins makes a clean warning for a crowded, warming planet that worries about doing the same. It flattered an anxiety we already had. It turned a remote island into a mirror, and a mirror is hard to argue with. The researchers who took the parable apart have made exactly this point. The island was treated as a lesson, convenient for the conclusions people wanted to draw, rather than as a place whose evidence had to be read on its own terms. The trouble is that a real people lived inside that lesson. and the lesson was wrong about them. So the account that survives stays narrow, and it stays open. There was no collapse before contact, but the island was real and poor and changed by the people who lived on it. The verdict is overturned, not replaced with a comfortable opposite. They were neither suicides nor innocents in an untouched paradise. They were a small, inventive people who made something extraordinary out of almost nothing for a very long time.
The statues are still standing in your mind, but they mean something different now than they did an hour ago. Not monuments to a people who tore down their own world to raise them, the work of a small, adaptive people who held a poor and isolated island for centuries, who walked their giants to the coast without felling a forest to do it, and who were then taken apart by something that arrived from outside, on a date, in the holds of ships, with a number. We were taught to read these people as a warning. The truer reading is quieter and harder. They did not fall. They were taken. And about 110 of them lived. Enough that their descendants are on the island still, and enough that, a century and a half later, it was the islanders' own blood that cleared their ancestors' name.